Thank you so much for coming this afternoon. I'm honored to be joined by Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel, and the CEO of Reddit, Steve Huffman, who is on his way and will walk in any minute. My name is Barbara van Schewick. I'm a professor here at Stanford Law School and the director of the Center for Internet and Society. I have a PhD in computer science and a law degree, and I've worked on net neutrality for the past 19 years, and it makes me really old, feel really old to admit that. The FCC's 2010 and 2015 Open Internet orders relied heavily on my work, as do the Indian and Canadian rules on zero rating and the European Union's net neutrality guidelines. We are here today because the open Internet's future is in doubt. In 2017, the FCC abolished all net neutrality protections and abdicated its duty to ensure the nation's most important communication system remains open and free. The repeal took effect last June, leaving American Internet users unprotected for the first time since the Internet's inception. Net neutrality is the principle that we, not the companies we pay to get online, get to decide what apps, services, and websites we use without interference. That means companies like Comcast, Verizon, and AT&T don't get to block, slow down, or speed up websites. They also can't charge websites for fast lanes to their subscribers or charge them for access to their subscribers at all. That's crucial because if your ISP blocks or slows down a website, then you just can't use it, and that service can't compete. Even more vitally, net neutrality protections ensure that every speaker has a chance to be heard, no matter the color of their skin or the size of their wallets. College students with an idea and a little bit of savings can invent the next Reddit or Reddit, and without having to find money to pay off Comcast, AT&T, Verizon, and more. It's easy to take this for granted, that you get to use whatever apps and services you want to use, or can start a blog or a company without having to get permission from phone and cable companies. But this is only because we have always had net neutrality in the United States. It's the secret sauce that has made the Internet awesome. Initially, net neutrality was baked into the technology of the Internet. But as the technology evolved, the FCC, under both Democratic and Republican leadership, stepped in over and over to stop phone and cable companies from interfering with what we do online. For instance, President Bush's first FCC chairman ordered an ISP to stop blocking an online calling service. Bush's second chairman ordered Comcast to stop blocking peer-to-peer services like BitTorrent. When the ISPs fought back in the courts, the FCC responded by adopting comprehensive net neutrality protections in 2010 and then again in 2015. Other countries haven't been so fortunate. For example, the European Union had no net neutrality protections until 2015, and phone and cable companies took full advantage. For instance, my husband's grandmother in Germany couldn't call us over Skype because her provider was blocking Skype on her cell phone. In the UK, many online games stopped working in the evening because ISPs were cracking down on peer-to-peer. We have seen the abuses when there are no protections, and we are starting to see them here in the United States, with unlimited plans that aren't actually unlimited, and mobile ISPs slowing down online video. That's why FCC Chairman Ajit Pai's repeal was so dangerous. He didn't just tinker at the edges of previous administrations' work. No, he abolished all net neutrality protections for the first time ever in the US. In fact, he went even further. His 2017 repeal order reinterpreted the law, concluding the FCC has no legal authority whatsoever to protect us against abuses by the companies we pay to get online. This literally stripped the word communications from the Federal Communications Commission. Pai's rationale is that ISPs can just be trusted to do the right thing. And if they do not, Americans have lots of choice for how they get online. It's a naive stance, at best. Most Americans have little or no choice for how they got online at home. It also ignores how vital the internet is to every aspect of our lives. Historically, we've treated industries that are critical to our economy and our rights with fairness principles and oversight. Delta can't refuse to sell you a ticket because of your political views. UPS and FedEx have to ship goods from any legal seller, whether they are selling peace flags or gun parts. Last summer, we saw what happens when you have an FCC that declares it is powerless to oversee the on-ramps to the internet. In the midst of the worst wildfire in California history, Santa Clara firefighters were called in to help battle the fires consuming Northern California. They used a mobile internet connection to help coordinate the thousands of firefighters and vehicles that were scrambling to stop the rampaging fire. In the midst of this maelstrom, Verizon slowed down the firefighters' connection to a trickle. When they got the firefighters' desperate pleas for help, Verizon suggested they could upgrade to a more expensive plan with a higher data cap. So they forced the firefighters to rely on personal devices to keep their systems running. Chairman Pai did not do anything. In fact, he never said a single word about the incident. Verizon's practices put Californians' lives at risk, and he literally thought it was not his problem. But it is a problem, and that's why people are fighting to restore net neutrality in the courts, in Congress, and in the states. Last year, California passed a law, SB 822, which was introduced by Senator Wiener from San Francisco, that brings back net neutrality in California. It's the only state-level law in the country that fully restores all of the protections that the FCC eliminated. That's why the law is widely viewed as a model for other states, and that's why it scared the federal government and ISPs so much that they sued to stop it hours after it was signed into law. The ISP's playbook is consistent. They publicly say they love net neutrality, but behind the scenes, they fight it at every turn. They defend the net neutrality repeal in court. They lobby incessantly to prevent net neutrality in Congress and in the states. And they sue the states that step in to protect their citizens. Their fallback position? Try to get Congress to pass the Swiss cheese version of net neutrality, full of holes to exploit, and hope that no one notices that the bills they support are net neutrality in name only. That's a problem. ISPs have many ways to pick winners and losers online. To be effective, a net neutrality law needs to protect against all of them. For example, the 2010 protections only prevented blocking and throttling as data moved inside an ISP's network, but they didn't apply to the point where data enters the ISP's network from the rest of the internet. In 2013, sensing a loophole, the 6 largest ISPs in the country started using choke points at the edges of their networks to slow down games and videos such as League of Legends and Netflix. Video buffered and games stuttered for tens of millions of Americans, but ISPs simply ignored their complaints. ISPs would only remove the choke points and restore fast service if the gaming and video sites paid them. The problems only stopped when the FCC closed this loophole in the 2015 order. Similarly, an ISP can give an advantage to its own content by speeding it up or by exempting it from users' data caps, while counting all other content against the cap. Given that Comcast owns NBC Universal and AT&T now owns Time Warner, this is not a hypothetical threat. In fact, it's already happening. A meaningful net neutrality law needs to protect against all of these threats. Things might be looking bleak for net neutrality now, But it's not time to despair or give up hope. After all, things have looked bleak for net neutrality before. When Verizon convinced the federal court to strike down the FCC's 2010 net neutrality protections in February 2014, people in DC thought no one would care if they simply replaced the existing protections with some toothless substitute. But grassroots groups refused to settle for meaningless protections. John Oliver picked up on their work, and millions of Americans flooded and crashed the FCC's website with comments demanding real net neutrality protections. That forced the FCC to adopt strong rules, grounded in real legal authority, leading to protections that were upheld in federal court twice. When the California net neutrality bill was moving through the legislature last summer, a California Assembly committee gutted the bill in a dramatic vote. The committee thought they could get away with it because the bill still said net neutrality on the cover. But Californian internet users revolted, self-organizing online and off. They funded billboards, hammered lawmakers with calls and at local meetings, projected giant images on AT&T's building in Oakland, and even left scathing reviews of lawmakers' local offices on Google Maps. Within weeks, the bill was back from the dead with all of the protections restored, and the lawmaker who had gutted the bill was now its loudest champion. Here's what this taught me. When our rights to speak freely online are in danger, when an ISP limits how we can connect to our friends and loved ones, when the dreams of entrepreneurs are threatened, we have collectively found a way to fight back. ISPs may have more money, and they definitely have more lobbyists, but that doesn't mean they get to win. They only win if we are silent. Don't be silent. Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce Congresswoman Anna Eshoo. And she is a fighter for net neutrality. She has been a leader for net neutrality for a long time. And she also happens to represent Silicon Valley, including Stanford. So please welcome Congresswoman.
Thank you very, very much, Barbara. Boy, that was a Net Neutrality 101 presentation. Thank you very much for your special leadership, for everything that you've done, Professor, your years of advocacy and your expertise. You've made a difference, and we all salute you. I am so thrilled that FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel said yes to the invitation to fly across the country today to be with us. So she's brilliant, she's pragmatic, she's effective, and she fights like hell for consumers at the FCC. I know because I have a front row seat listening and watching because I'm on the committee that has jurisdiction over the FCC. So Jessica, thank you. Thank you for your work, for your leadership, and for being with us. To Steve Huffman for demonstrating the private sector leadership for an open internet at Reddit. And last but not least, a single here at the Stanford Law School and the Center for Internet Society, and for doing all the organizing for this event. To all of you, we wouldn't have an event unless you showed up. So thank you very, very much. Now, Professor Barbara really walked you through what happened last year during the worst fires in California's history. And we've had some, but the worst. Now, this is organizing of firefighters and so many others that are part of that effort from throughout the state and from different parts of the country. And they have to be able to communicate with one another. We know what happens when first responders can't communicate with each other. September 11th, firefighters and police officers. And the Congress, I led the effort to correct that so that there would be interoperability. But to think that that Verizon would actually throttle their efforts is shameful in our country. These are people that are putting their lives on the line to save other people's lives. And when they made the call to Verizon, they said, we can sell you a higher rate of speed for X number of dollars. Is they're doing what they're doing. So the notion on the part of some of my colleagues that we're in pretend land, that throttling and all that comes with it really doesn't happen is nonsense. It's nonsense, and it's shameful. So, people say to me, well, why would they do what they do? It's simple. It's money. It's money. It's more money. Juxtapose that with where the American people are on net neutrality. The only place where there's a debate on this, my friends, is in Washington, D.C. People across the country made up their minds a long time ago, and they've been consistent in terms of their support for net neutrality. 90% of Democrats, 80-some% of Republicans, 85% of independents. That's just about everybody in our country. They've made up their minds. And the support for net neutrality and the bill that we introduced at the very beginning was the very first bill we introduced and passed at the subcommittee, Communications and Technology. That's where the first table is set on this issue. And I have the privilege of having served on this committee for a long time. It's the very first bill we passed. 3-page bill, restores the 2015 rules. Just as simple as that. How's that? I know you can you're stunned, aren't you? A 3-page bill. A 3-page bill. So we have, the debate is in D.C. The debate is in D.C. The 2015 Open Internet Order that Professor von Schewick referenced, it banned unjust and unreasonable practices. So when we talk about the Santa Clara County firefighters, that fits in, doesn't it? Unjust and unreasonable. And by the way, Santa Clara County is suing Verizon on this. And we have never really heard from the chairman of the FCC on this. He was, by the way, the general counsel for Verizon before he went to the FCC. I think he still is. But this is about having a cop on the beat. This is about having a cop on the beat. This is not something that any one of us as individuals can take care of ourselves. And it's always a yardstick by which I measure very quickly in my mind, does the government belong in this or does it not? No one can fix this on their own. There needs to be one law for everyone in the entire country that protects the internet. And it's certainly, it's important in every community, of course. Here in the Valley, in Silicon Valley, one of the strongest cases that's been made for it are by the very, very small companies, the startups, because they cannot afford to have an elephant's hoof on their business and have to pay more. They simply can't afford it. It is, many of them have said to me, it's the difference between being able to stay in business and try to grow or shutting the lights off, close the door, lock it, and end of the business. So I've had the pleasure of being one of a real warrior on this issue for many years because it's been at the committee for many years. In fact, some of my colleagues have dubbed me the mother net neutrality. I think that there's another pronunciation for that on the part of those that don't agree with me. But I'm not going to give you 10 years history on it, but you know what the case is, for it. What do those that are opposed to this, what do they say? And I think that you're going to find this very interesting. There are two lines of attack on this. Number one, that it will chill investment. My Republican colleagues, oh my goodness, they just shiver and shake when they say this is going to chill investment. Well, I don't know how many of you know this. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, requires by law that when CEOs of companies are speaking to their quarterly reports, they are required by law, they cannot fudge on this, required by law to inform shareholders if there is something that is chilling the investment and the profitability of that company. Not once has any CEO reported this. Not once. You follow the stock market, the ISPs, the cable companies, they're all doing fine. They're all doing fine. The other charge, and of course Commissioner Rosenworcel has heard this ad nauseum as well, is that that we are trying to regulate the internet, as if they love it so much. We're trying to regulate the internet with utility-type regulation. In other words, we're reaching back. We have such old minds and cobwebs in our intellect that we're reaching back to the 1940s. Utility-type regulation. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. What we adopted in terms of the Communications Act, there are how many sections in that, Jessica? 40-some in the Communications Act? We had forbearance. We forbore the overwhelming majority of those regulations. So it's a very, very light touch. And truth be known, Republicans and Democrats, they actually, when you look at those sections, they agree. It's to protect the disabled and sections that really need to be held onto. But the forbearance was the overwhelming majority of the other parts of it. We did not place in the bill. So their excuses, which I just outlined, really it's not a case that really holds any water. In fact, you don't even have to scratch very deeply to a lower layer. You're just like a scratcher. You just scratch a little bit, the number comes up. It's a phony baloney argument that they advance. But they are there to protect the ISPs. That's really what it is, and it's about money. And it's about campaign contributions, too. Because these are outfits that have really an army of lobbyists just for the regulatory agencies, and then another army of lobbyists for the Congress. So that's why it is what it is in Washington. In the rest of the country, it's crystal clear. Now, some have suggested that the internet, has flourished because the government hasn't played a role in it. Well, there's a combination of public and private, but there really would not be an internet without the investments that the American taxpayers have made and the key regulatory decisions that the federal government has made. We've always played a critical role in overseeing the operators of major networks like the internet. In the 60s and 70s, the Department of Defense, through DARPA, funded the researchers, including at SRI down the road, to develop packet switching, the internet's technical underpinning, and ARPANET, the original predecessor to the internet. Department of DOD, the DOD employees helped write the TCP and the IP, which are still the main protocols of the internet. in the 80s and the 90s, the National Science Foundation, NSF, funded the NSFNet for academic network uses, and Congress opened it up for commercial use in the High Performance Computing Act of 1991, the year before I was elected to Congress, which also created funding for Mosaic, the first browser. You remember that one? Yeah, you see some heads nodding here. NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, coordinated internet governance in the 90s and the 2000s. I had my hand many times in that. And today, many agencies participate in the ongoing multi-stakeholder internet governance meetings. So, of course, there are many companies, many individuals, academics, entrepreneurs, and other pioneers right here in our congressional district and across the United States that played an essential roles in the development of the internet. But we really can't ignore, and I think it should be a source of pride to all of us, that those investments were made and that they have paid off for the American people. It's a very good story. It's a very good story. It's a very good American story. So, and for those that say we shouldn't be doing anything because everything is all right, I would say back to them that our government has historically set the rules for powerful networks such as railroads, the telegraph, and telephone networks. And these networks produced previously unimaginable benefits for the American people. So I think it's the role that for the government to ensure that these operators of these networks cannot abuse their power. And that's what this fight is about. But it's a worthy fight. It's a great fight to be a part of. And I predict we're going to win. The case has been taken to court more than once, and we have won both times. Another case has been, I love it when they come before to testify, the chairman and others that don't believe in what we believe in here, and talk about this is just gone on too long. We should have a compromise in the Congress because of this and of that. And they go on and on and on. And I interrupted a former chairman of the FCC, Mr. Powell, who's really a lovely man. He's now head of the National Cable Association. He's Colin Powell's son. I said, go ask your father what he thinks, you know. But at any rate, I interrupted him and said, well, you're the ones that went to court to slow it down. Is that not so, sir? So he just smiled and put his head down. So what's next in this? I just want to leave you with this. We brought the bill up. It was the very first bill in our subcommittee, Communications and Technology. We had a legislative hearing. We then passed the bill. We had a markup, that's writing of the bill, essentially, and the vote on it. We passed it very swiftly out of our subcommittee. It went to the full committee passed it, got to the floor. The United States House of Representatives passed it with a little bit of Republican support, but you can still call it bipartisan, which I think their leadership may not be too happy about, but it was bipartisan. And now it is up to the Senate. I think you all know that the Congress is not a proactive institution. It is I don't know what got into me because I thought that it was before I got there. But we know what to do from the inside. But Congress moves when it's pushed from the outside. And if there's anything, if you can forget everything else that I've said today, but take that home with you. And that's why advocates are the force, the power and the force in our country on everything, and certainly on this. So advocates have to lean in very hard on the majority leader of the Senate to simply allow this bill, 3-page bill, to be debated and voted on on the floor of the United States Senate. I predict it passes there. I predict it passes there. We had a little test thing in the last Congress with the CRA, and I think that allow senators to have to go home and tell their constituents if they voted no on net neutrality, why they did, and all of these people that support it, they'll weigh in on them, and those that vote aye, then they should be showered with gratitude. So the advocates have to lean in because that's where it is now. And I believe this is doable. I believe that the courts will uphold the entire case for 2015 rules. They are reasonable. The American people believe that. That's the power in the case. And I want you to know how proud I am to represent you. You're enormous source of pride to me. I brag about this congressional district to all of my colleagues constantly. They say, we know, you represent the most distinguished congressional district in the country. They all love theirs, and they're entitled to that. But there is no place like this place. Of course, Stanford has played a historic role in the growth of the Valley, and the contributions that are generated from this place really are felt around the world. So thank you to each one of you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
You know, when I got to Washington, I was told never to speak after a member of Congress. And to add insult to injury, I am also speaking after my friend Barbara spoke, and she is the intellectual anchor of net neutrality, and we have the congressional warrior. So here are a few things about me, or two more accurately. First, I am the only woman commissioner at the FCC. Second, I am the only commissioner at the FCC right now who voted against the decision to roll back net neutrality. And I believed then, and I believe to this day right now, that it was a mistake to burn down those rules. And here's why. The future of the internet, like it or not, is the future of everything. There is nothing in our social, civic, or commercial lives that is untouched by its influence or unmoved by its power. And the openness that has been the governing principle of our policies has made the U.S. internet economy the envy of the world. We should be taking steps to sustain that openness and make sure it continues. And in fact, that openness is part of a long tradition in this country. Think back to the telephone network. You could pick up the phone and call who you wanted when you wanted. The call went through. Your telephone company didn't have the power to decide who you could call and when. As the networks evolved, we had internet access. And in the early days of the Bush administration, the FCC decided to articulate for the first time net neutrality principles. Those principles were updated over time and ultimately resulted in a 2015 decision that, when a court reviewed it, said these are good stuff. No blocking, no throttling, no paid prioritization. In 184 pages, the court came back and told us these rules were solid. And you know, the American people agreed. Because when the FCC decided to roll back those rules and burn down those policies, something amazing happened. Because when I started at the FCC, people would be like, what, the FTC? The FCC? FTC? Which one is that? The truth is, millions of people found us. They jammed our phone lines, they filled up our email inboxes, and they broke our online comment system. That's democracy in action. That's people speaking up and telling Washington they're about to go somewhere they don't like. Don't ever forget that is the most important democratic power we all have. Because they saw what I think I saw, which is that the FCC was about to give our internet providers the right to block websites, throttle services, and censor online content. And with that power, they can manipulate what we see and read and learn online. They can constrain not just how we consume content online, but how all of us as entrepreneurs create. I don't think that's a good thing. And the data show that 86% of the American public agree, so I think the FCC got it wrong. But I refuse to be pessimistic about it at this point because I think back to all that energy that came into my office and my colleagues' offices, and I also look at what happened in the wake of our decision. We had 5 states that passed their own net neutrality laws, starting right here with California. We had 6 governors who wrote executive orders demanding that net neutrality become a condition of every state contract. In states as big as New York and as unpopulated as Montana. We had 23 states' attorneys general get together to sue the FCC. Bring it, as far as I'm concerned. And we had 232 members of Congress, one of whom's here today, vote to support the Save the Internet Act to fix what the FCC got so wrong. All of that is democracy in action. And we need to keep that energy up as this moves through courthouses and back to Congress, because I think the American public supports net neutrality, and I think there's great power in us continuing to come together and make a ruckus to support an open internet. Thank you.
I work as a fellow here at Stanford in the Center for Internet and Society. But before this, I used to be a journalist at Wired. And maybe my biggest claim to fame was that in 2005, I wrote an article that included a bit about Reddit when it had, I think, 800 users.
I think so.
Yeah.
Maybe we weren't very good at counting traffic back then.
So I've known Steve for a while, so I'm very excited to have him here. This is Steve Huffman, CEO and one of the co-founders of Reddit. Came down from early on, one of Reddit's tagline was with the front page of the internet, the idea that user submissions and user votings gave a good sense of what the pulse of the internet was at any given time. What has Reddit become? What is it now? How do you describe it?
I have a lengthy description of Reddit, but it's true, back then we said we were the front page of the internet, fairly tongue-in-cheek. And maybe our tongues are still in our cheeks today, but we have grown into something like that. But something I said a few years ago as a joke about Reddit has actually turned into part of our product strategy, which is people come to, we used to say, they come for the cats and they stay for the community. And so back then, it really was cats and news and funny stuff, internet culture, whatever you might find. But back then, Reddit was just one big pile of links. And when we allowed users to create their own communities, that's when Reddit really kind of took off and grew into what it is today. And that was over 10 years ago. So Reddit is a network of communities, but describing Reddit as a network of communities is like describing the internet as a network of computers. It is technically true, but it misses the kind of the deeper purpose there. And so the metaphor I use for Reddit most often these days is that of a city. Reddit is a city. Cities have founders technically, but founders are irrelevant. Really, cities are created by their citizens. And cities they grow and they evolve. They have neighborhoods. Neighborhoods have different cultures and vibes and norms, and that's very much a metaphor that works well for Reddit. We have communities, and our communities have their own norms and values and vibes as well. And so we think of ourselves at Reddit Inc. as like the city government. We provide police and transportation and sewage, but really it's up to our platform to grow and evolve. And that's part of the fun thing about working at Reddit is kind of studying that and watching that happen.
That's cool. I like the idea of Reddit as a city and sort of founding it. I've just been rewatching Deadwood, which is sort of the founding of a city ahead of the movie coming out, I think today maybe. So that makes me sort of think back to that sort of beginning, like when you were small and tiny, like what was it about net neutrality that allowed you to build Reddit?
Yeah, in 2005, the internet was a different place. Twitter didn't exist yet. Facebook was for college kids. YouTube was like 2 months old. Google's motto was "Don't be evil," and so Reddit came alive during that era. And over the last decade, everything has changed. The internet has become more closed and more consolidated. Net neutrality rules have shifted, and we think of Reddit as the last outpost of the free and open internet. And so what was, net neutrality wasn't even something we considered in the same way that it wasn't like free speech wasn't a thing we considered. It was just part of the DNA of the internet. It was the fabric of the internet. And it was the magic of the internet that anybody could share anything without, on equal footing. And Reddit came alive in an era actually as a reaction against media and marketing. We felt everybody's lying to us. Like everything is bullshit, and we want to make a place that is very authentic. And when you get to the more, I guess, kind of philosophical or idealistic aspects of net neutrality, that's what we're talking about: is openness and free access to information. I think what would happen now without net neutrality, YouTube. We spend a lot of time talking about ISPs today. I think ISPs is not quite an accurate description of these companies. These are the largest media companies in the world. Do you think that Comcast would let YouTube survive its infancy if it knew what it was going to turn into? Of course not. It's an existential threat to them. And without net neutrality, companies like YouTube or Netflix would not exist. It's like, in fact, they've tried to stifle these things, and they make their own shitty competing streaming services. The protections that net neutrality provide allow companies that were once tiny to grow into very successful businesses. And we believe that's critically important to not just the internet, but our whole economy.
That sort of and when is it like that sort of like the small company thing? So one of the things that I found was very interesting, there was like a footnote in the 2017 repeal order that said fast lanes are actually going to be good for startups because they can just pay to be in the fast lanes ahead of the incumbent providers. We sort of assume that like all startups have like this gigantic pile of VC money, and it's not really kind of how it works.
It's not. Reddit, our first fundraise was $12,000. Our second was $70,000. That was for the first year and a half. Now, assuming that the ISPs would pick up the phone when, two guys outside of Boston called them, which they would not, that is, it's not even a rounding error. It's like sub-rounding error, all of the money we had. And so it makes that argument is completely ludicrous. Even an example today, I think if you're a T-Mobile customer, you don't pay for data if you use Spotify. Streaming music is expensive. Like that bandwidth costs money. If you're a startup and you're streaming music and people can use your bigger competitor's product for free, it puts you at a disadvantage. So these are monopolistic behaviors that are alive and well even today. And net neutrality in theory is supposed to prevent that sort of thing. So it's very difficult. There's a reason why, even without net neutrality, it's very difficult to get these companies up off the ground because the economics get better at scale. And before you have scale, it is simply very expensive.
Speaking of being at scale, you're no longer that small company. You're number 4 in the U.S.-ish?
Give or take.
Okay.
One.
Oh, give or take one. Okay, all right. Which is amazing. That's fantastic. But you're at the size now, why do you care about net neutrality?
As I mentioned, we think of ourselves as the last outpost of the free and open internet. We are a hopelessly and sometimes naively idealistic company about these things. And the reason we exist is we think, and I know this is going to sound grandiose, but we feel like we're fulfilling the promise of the internet. That is what we believe. And we believe that if we succeed, we will have brought community and belonging to everybody in the world. And that one of the founding principles of Reddit is that it's a meritocracy. Every idea can survive and flourish, or not. And so that is in our DNA is fighting for an open internet. And we've grown into an alternative as an alternative source of news and entertainment and media. In which case that makes our competitors these other media companies that would prefer we don't exist.
Fair, yeah. AT&T did buy Time Warner for $104 billion. So I wanted to get to 1 second to talk about the sort of Redditors and communities. So, a lot of the fun of Reddit is that people on Reddit don't agree with each other. The fights are really fun. Sometimes some of them are awful, but the good fights are fun. But almost everyone on Reddit seems to support net neutrality.
It's incredible. It's literally the only thing that Reddit agrees on. And Reddit is really a reflection of what's going on in the country. A pretty accurate reflection, I'd say. And so, it's crazy to me that Reddit believes or agrees on anything. And even more so in a time where we live in an incredibly politically divisive time. The level of discourse is suboptimal. And yet, people agree on this issue. And it's pitched, I think, to the American people as a political issue. But the only people for whom it's political for are politicians. Everybody else agrees. And so it is bewildering to me that we've gotten to this point and that people aren't more upset about it. There are plenty of things to argue about, but this just isn't one of them.
Oh, I would love to keep going and asking you more, but I think other people in the audience would like to ask questions of everyone. So I think now might be a good time to have everybody come up. And
is that part of the recording? Okay, my name is Helen Mickiewicz. I'm an assistant general counsel at the California Public Utilities Commission. We were also a party to the challenge of the net neutrality decision to the D.C. Circuit, and I was at the oral argument, as was Commissioner Rosenworcel and Professor, and I wanted to know what your predictions are, and I'll tell you what mine is. I think we won. And I know you're not supposed to ever say that, but I think we're going to win on reclassification.
So first, for folks that were talking about the oral argument, is there's the challenge to the 2017 repeal order that was heard on February 1st in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, and we are likely to have a decision on that as soon as tomorrow morning. So it is coming up very, very soon.
All right. I'll go before the law professor. I sat through 5.5 hours of oral argument on February 1st. I was the only FCC commissioner to do so. 5.5 hours is a long, I know we're in Stanford Law School, but that's a really long oral argument. Lots and lots of issues came up. But I, too, left with the impression that in some shape or form, something would be remanded and sent back to the FCC. And I am hopeful that that happens, if not tomorrow, within the next few months, and that with public pressure, the agency decides to do this differently the next time around. But I'm going to leave the legal niceties to the law professor who's sitting here.
Yeah, I was there too. It was a lot of fun. I mean, the way you know people are geeks when they have fun at a 5-hour legal argument. So I would say never bet on what a court will do, and so I won't make a prediction. But there were 2 dark horse arguments that hadn't been on anybody's radar, and they are really worth watching for. One was this idea that the FCC refused to consider the impact that its decision to eliminate net neutrality and its oversight over the Internet access services would have on public safety. You know, the Communications Act says making sure that the American people are safe is one of the key considerations that the agency needs to have in mind as it makes decisions. And courts have upheld that kind of idea before. So it turns out students at Stanford Law School, so if I see a couple of them in the audience, worked with Santa Clara County to make exactly those arguments long before, you know, Verizon throttled the firefighters. And they said, you know, today there are all these things we do that rely on the internet and where we need the public to have net neutrality so that our police people can dial into the mobile command center and things like that. But the FCC totally ignored it, didn't even say a single word about it. And then in oral argument said, well, you know, we think the market will just fix everything. And, you know, you could totally see the court picking up of that, and Santa Clara arguments really resonated with the court that, well, maybe the market is pretty good at a lot of things, but guaranteeing public safety is probably not one of them. And so sort of now my insider prediction is that this is one of the things that might really carry the day. I won't bore you with all of the other stuff. The decision tree for how this decision might end up is really, really complicated. And so I suggest we wait and see. But we are all, like every Friday and Tuesday morning, people who care about net neutrality are sort of clicking refresh on the court's website because that's when the decision will come down.
Welcome. My name's Heather Hudson. I'm a professor of communication policy, and I've met a couple of you before. I just had a comment and then a question. I completely agree with the opening comments about emergency networks and that no provider should be allowed to throttle emergency communication. But there is a new network that's about to be introduced called FirstNet. I've been on the advisory council for FirstNet, which is the first responders communication authority, which is designed to overcome that problem from 2001 and other examples you cited of first responders not being able to communicate with each other and not being able to get through. It's supposed to prioritize bandwidth and not have those congestion. But so I have a couple of thoughts. One is it's supposed to do that, but we don't know yet how well that will work. Second, the contract went to AT&T and Verizon is confusing a lot of first responders who have to sign up for it about whether or not they need to. There are alternatives. And second and third, it will not reach right away without much more funding. A lot of first responders in rural areas. I worked in Alaska and met Jessica from that, but rural California, you don't have to go far from here to have poor coverage. So I think that's worth keeping in mind that we need vigilance to see how well FirstNet will work. But second, as a strategy, I think we need to emphasize some of the comments that were made by the last speakers about businesses and competition and open access, because the carriers may well just say, well, emergency communication, that's not a problem. Just wait 6 months and, you know, that's not relevant. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on the strategy, but I do think FirstNet is supposed to be a solution, but we don't know how well it will work, how much take-up there will be, and how widespread its availability will be.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll take a stab at this. First of all, thank you for your work and for your good question. We don't know yet how effective FirstNet is going to be. It was born out of the following. Do you all remember the 9/11 Commission that was put together by the Congress? And the Commission had many recommendations. I don't know if there were 10 or 15 or what, but there was one where the Congress had not made good on, and that was to address the whole issue of interoperability for public safety in our country. And I referenced it, touched on it in my earlier remarks. So I took that up and did the legislation that then created FirstNet. And what this thing reminds me of is a saying that I have, that there are always two clocks on the wall. One is regular time, the other is government time. It has taken them so long to get to the point that they're at now. There are a lot of differences between the public safety people about which way to go and all of that. There are layers and layers of it. But has that all of the work that needs to be done for interoperability in our country, has that been addressed? No, it hasn't. It hasn't. And I'm frustrated by the slowness of it. We've had a series of heads of, I don't know, they're called chairmen or whatever they're called. Yeah, CEO of, yeah, exactly. And they don't seem to last very long. I don't know why. What I'm trying to do now is to get some real money into all of our local communities in states across the country, into the PSAPs, the public safety system, so that they can do the upgrades there, because so many of them can't use or accept text or video or any of that. So I'm sorry to say the jury is still out. You're one of the first constituents that's ever, besides a first responder, that's ever used the words FirstNet.
It should be an important step, but I agree
it is, yeah.
Necessarily solve the whole problem. But it could take some of the air out of some of the arguments that would be made.
Yeah, and let me just add, because the question sometimes comes up, the open internet rules, both in 2010 and 2015, have an explicit exception that allows internet service providers to do whatever is necessary to make sure, to meet the needs of public safety and law enforcement. And so from that perspective, they would be totally compatible with that kind of thing.
They wouldn't be, butting heads.
Hi, my name is Tyler Snell. I'm actually a Menlo Park native and was on the Congresswoman's high school advisory board back too many years ago. But we studied bias in the media, and something I've continued to study. And so first question is for Steve. I saw a lot of propaganda on Reddit back prior to the 2016 election, and it seems like you guys have really cleaned up the act in a way that is admirable, and a lot of other social media companies haven't seemed to be doing or willing to do. What has been, what type of propaganda do you still continue to fight? What have you guys been willing to do that others haven't, that have led to that success?
Thanks for the question, and thanks for noticing. So, the way Reddit works is kind of fundamentally different than our peers. There are three tiers of governance on Reddit. There's our like Reddit Inc. We have our content policy. It's short, but it's very important that we do our best to enforce site-wide. More importantly, everything else is powered by our users. And so, Facebook has their policies, Twitter has theirs, we have ours, Google has theirs. What we have is an additional layer of moderation and then community involvement that's very powerful and much more scalable. So our communities are created by moderators, which are just users who create communities. And our communities set rules that they enforce. And then on top of that, every post or comment on Reddit has upvotes and downvotes, which allow the communities to accept or reject content that they don't like. And the way this helps protect Reddit from that sort of manipulation is that people, not just our users, but people in general, I think are very good at detecting propaganda and bullshit and fake news. And if you empower them to do so, they can reject it. So, for example, in the 2016 election, we did see some of that state-sponsored content from Russia in attempts, but it just didn't go very far. It was submitted just like anything else. It just wasn't very successful, outside of like a couple particular echo chambers, but when you go to those communities, you know what you're getting. And one of the sayings that we have is the only thing that scales with users is users. And we think of our job at Reddit Inc. is to ensure that the conversation is fair, that the volume of any particular viewpoint on Reddit is in proportion to the number of people who have it. So separating the difference between behavior and beliefs. You can have whatever belief you like, but it's your behavior that we care about. So if our voting systems have integrity and our processes are working, then that allows the communities overall to kind of self-regulate and self-heal and set their own standards for discussion. And that's very, very effective, not just from an execution point of view, but also from a kind of acceptance and political point of view. It's a very different conversation from a private company or even worse, the government saying, you can say this but not that, versus your peers saying, we don't want that here. For example, hate speech is a topic of conversation in the country right now. Reddit, we do not have a formal hate speech policy in our content policy. We have a violent speech policy, and we have harassment policies, and that gets a lot of the stuff that I think we would all say, like, hey, that's hateful. But there's definitely a gray area in the middle. And what we found is much more effective than trying to figure out, like, are jokes okay? Is this word okay or not? 96 of our top 100 communities have hate speech policies. They all define it a little bit differently, and they all enforce it a little bit differently. But fundamentally, they've taken that burden on themselves, and it's much more effective. So as we go forward, I look at our peers who are, we're going to hire 30,000 trust and safety experts who are going to somehow, adjudicate the political situation in Myanmar. Like, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. Versus we think, how can we empower our users and communities to reject fake news, to reject propaganda, to reject hate. That's the path that we're on, and we've seen some success there. And I say that knowing we can probably do even more.
I actually ran into one of those today, so I tried to post to r/technology, which is one of the biggest Reddits, right? And it's very busy. And I posted, like, hey, I'm going to be interviewing Steve. Like, what question should I ask? And I got rejected because he said, you're writing about net neutrality. Everybody writes about net neutrality. We have too much net neutrality. And this is a personal post about yourself. Try again another time.
Nice try.
Yeah. It did much better in r/Stanford, so that was
okay. There you go.
Yeah. Sorry, I think we had a question over here. Oh, got one there. Great.
Hi there, Ward Hanson. I'm an economist here at Stanford. Although I'm just finishing up co-teaching a class with Aeroastro on space policy, and want to first commend the FCC for allowing the LEO constellations to proceed. Legislation might be the best and easiest solution, but competition is helpful. And we just saw the Starlink begin to launch last week. There may be 2 or 3 effective high-speed competitors to each of the local ISPs. Some questions about making sure they don't get bought up by the Comcasts and the Verizons of the world. And the FCC's thoughts about these LEO constellations and the Congresswoman's thoughts about antitrust enforcement of that and ownership.
Oh, there's so much in that. Okay, let me start with competition. We need more broadband competition in this country. I think we'd all agree. That's a really simple proposition to talk about. And it's the thing that stuns me most about our net neutrality decision, because the FCC's own data show that half the households in this country have no choice of broadband provider. So if your broadband provider starts denying you access to Reddit or telling you you can't look at a congressional hearing in anything like real time, you can't pick up and take your business elsewhere. Now, could that change in the future as new technologies evolve? I'm an optimist about new technologies. There are so many exciting things happening in our skies with satellites and nanosatellites right now. We're in a new space age. We are going to create possibilities for connectivity in parts of this country and the globe that do not have it today, and probably would never have it with terrestrial networks. So I think there are great things coming. But I think the period between now and then matters a lot. And given that that could be multiple years, a decade, I think we have to think about it actively with our policies here on the ground right now. But I still have a lot of optimism for what's going to happen in our skies, but I also have a lot of concerns about orbital debris, because we are sending more stuff into our skies than we ever have before, and we need policies to make sure it all works, both in our skies and back down here on Earth.
And we have, Jessica, more than one company in Silicon Valley that's addressing the debris in space. So we've got
I know, you're
we've
only
got
worried
something
about
of just about
You don't
everything
have to
here.
be worried about junk down here.
That's
and
right,
glitter.
yeah,
Now
yeah.
I'm worrying you about glitter
Exactly,
in our skies
exactly.
beyond what you can see.
Well, I think that, well, obviously I agree with what Jessica said. And I always am amazed on this issue of competition because the companies come in and they use the word constantly, except when it has to be applied to them. So, you know, so many of these, what I call the big boys, is that they, if they sense competition or see competition 5,000 miles away, they'll go and squash it like a bug. They will squash it like a bug. So I think that there will be, as there is, we're getting close to or just about there on the issue of privacy and what that means and the practices of some of the companies, there's a tipping point in these things. There really is a tipping point. I think that whomever really seizes the real opportunities with 5G, I mean, they're all talking about 5G. It's like the sex, drugs, rock and roll, you know, in the telecommunications industry, except no one is, it's not out there. It hasn't been developed, but they have full page ads like it was a baby that was born a couple of years ago. But I think that whomever seizes this opportunity is going to be ahead of the pack, and that in and of itself can create a lot of competition. But attached to that is, for my words to come true, is that the FCC has to do the right job, and the chairman is so off base in terms of the spectrum that he says he's going to use. I mean, the spectrum that he's selecting for 5G operates between the edge of this table and the end of this table. And that's not going to do it. It's not going to do the job. So Jessica's got to take care of that. She has to take care of that. And maybe Congress has to pound him on the head a little, too. So
let me just add one thing, because we're talking about net neutrality, and many people often think, well, if only we had more competition, that would totally kill off net neutrality. And so what's really important to understand is that competition is awesome for all sorts of things. It brings down prices. It motivates the competing ISPs to deploy faster networks, but it doesn't really help with net neutrality. And the reason we know this is because Europe did this experiment for us. Lucky for us, they decided they have so much more competition for broadband internet access, and that's true. And so they thought, we don't really need net neutrality. We just need a really simple rule that says you can block and discriminate as much as you like, as long as you tell your customers about it. That was the rule that the European Union adopted in 2009. And it failed spectacularly. So there was widespread blocking and discrimination in many European countries. All of the ISPs blocked online telephony. They managed their networks in a way that made it impossible to use certain applications from 5 p.m. to midnight. And sort of often these kinds of practices affected up to 95% of the users in a country. And so in 2015, the European Union looked at this and said, okay, we got it. You know, we have a lot of competition. We are really proud of that, but it doesn't help us with net neutrality. So let's adopt real net neutrality protections. And they adopted rules that were modeled after the FCC's 2015 open internet rules. So let's keep fighting for competition, but don't think it resolves the net neutrality problem.
Hi, my name is Jim Fenton. I'm an independent technologist, and let me start by thanking you all for your leadership on this. Congresswoman Eshoo mentioned earlier that we might be the loss of network neutrality might be taking us back to the 1940s. And I'm actually worried that it might be worse than that. Because as somebody else mentioned, it used to be that when you made a phone call, you could call anybody that you wanted. Now, I have a less nuanced understanding of all of the policy issues, but I always thought that there was this bargain that a common carrier could not take responsibility for the content as long as they didn't restrict certain things, as long as they treated everything equally. But, of course, nobody wants to take responsibility for the content on the internet. So I'm wondering why it isn't that simple. Why don't we just have this common carrier bargain that forces network neutrality because nobody wants to deal with the content?
You want to take it, Barbara?
Well, so I think that's part of the problem with the debate we are having, that around the country, people look at the world and they say, wow, there are a few services that are really essential. Water, electricity, telephony, and today, the internet as well. You know, my kids can't do their homework if they don't have access to the internet. And so with that kind of thinking, it's legitimate to say that, yeah, for those kinds of services, we have always had some rules that make sure that they are accessible to all at reasonable prices and, you know, can't make distinctions between what people can do with the service. Of course, people can charge for the service. You know, if we use more electricity, we need to pay more money, and that's all totally fine. So it sounds like a total no-brainer. And that's what the FCC did in 2015. When they put net neutrality on a new legal foundation, they said, hey, let's treat net neutrality as common carriers, and let's get rid of all the old rules that we clearly don't need. You know, rate regulation, we don't need that anymore. Tariffing, you know, where you need to sort of ask the FCC for permission for your prices and services months in advance. No, we don't need that anymore. And they really only left, sort of apart from the net neutrality stuff, a few rules that said, hey, independent ISPs should have the ability to get their wires on the poles. Disabled people should be able to get access to the internet as well. And we should be able to use universal service funds to help sponsor network deployment in rural areas. So when people hear that, it sounds pretty reasonable. That's not how it's being framed in DC. Sort of in DC, the ISPs have worked very hard since at least 2010 to frame this as what they call the nuclear option. And, you know, so much that in 2014, people thought there is no way the FCC will ever classify the ISPs as common carriers because it's so politically toxic that you just can't do it. And so that's why everybody on the panel here keeps saying, hey, people, go out and talk to your representatives, talk to your friends and tell them to talk to their representatives. And if they live in states that are currently governed by Republicans, then, you know, it's even better to talk to them because that's the only thing that is going to bring change here. This is not complicated. This is more a question of how things are being framed in Washington and who gets to call the shots in Washington. And right now, unfortunately, and I hate to say this, the majority of the Republican Party isn't listening to its constituents, but it's listening to the ISPs. Fortunately, and I also want to say that because a lot of people don't know that is really changing. You know, you hinted at that, but when Congress tried to undo the net neutrality repeal through this sort of somewhat idiosyncratic tool called Congressional Review Act, the Senate, with the votes of 3 Republican senators, Senator Kennedy, Senator Murkowski, and Senator Collins, voted to bring back the rules. And so there were Republicans in the House that have introduced awesome net neutrality rules that voted for this in the California legislature. 1/3 of the Republican caucus in the Assembly voted for the California net neutrality bill. So the history is changing slowly, but you know, that's what I'm saying. I'm pretty hopeful that we get there. but it really takes effort from everybody because sort of things won't change on their own.
We might have time for maybe one more question, maybe two, depending.
I want to say I see a lot of students here, and I really want to have a couple of questions from the students. If I'm teaching a class on net neutrality, and so there are all these people in the class, and I'm sure you have awesome things to say, and so, you know,
Great.
take
All
a
right, so
heart.
we're getting close, so we're going to do lightning round, fast questions, fast answers.
Thank you so much. My name is Xiaocao Li. I came from Berkeley Law. I'm a visiting scholar there. Can I have a question for Professor Schewick? And my question is, now many ISPs get some kinds of direct benefits from the business. Since the direct benefit element is read a broad way, such as your users' flow will be satisfied. And so the controllability will be the only defense for the ISPs to not be liable. So what should the ISPs do not to lose the neutrality role? And should they take active monitor measures or not? Thank you.
I'm not sure I understood the question. Were you asking about liability for ISPs?
Yes. What should the ISPs do not to lose the authority?
Not to lose their
Not to lose
authority?
the liability.
So I think in terms of privacy, I don't think it's the ISP's job to monitor what we are doing online. And in fact, sort of in all the net neutrality lawsuits, or in other lawsuits, the ISPs generally take advantage of intermediary liability protections where they say, you know, we should not be in the business of checking what people are doing. But that is clearly a really important debate. And, you know, in 2015, the FCC adopted pretty cool privacy protections for internet access. That was one of the other things that happened as a result of the 2015 order. And, you know, the first thing Congress did after the election was undo those privacy protections. And I think you have done a lot of work on that. And yes, those are really important questions.
Hi, I'm an undergraduate student here and also an avid user of Reddit. So earlier you were talking about how you couldn't make the post on our technology, so you went to our Stanford. So I looked at the post, and the top comment on that post says, I wonder if we'll take questions on why Reddit allows and profits off hate speech and hate subs. And, you know, like you said earlier, 96 out of the top 100 subreddits have rules against hate speech, but what about the other 4? And these aren't like a random 4 subreddits, or 4 of the top 100 on the website. So,
yeah, it's a good question. Although, well, I don't know if it's a good question. To say that we allow and profit off of hate speech, I think, would be misrepresenting how Reddit works. I actually don't know the 4 communities that don't off the top of my head. But that question is usually coming from people who are asking us to remove the community for Donald Trump supporters. And I don't think that's a good argument because it's not an accurate argument. It's not an accurate reflection of what that community is. The community that I'm thinking of in particular is called Donald, and they are crass, they are trolls, they antagonize the rest of the site, but their ethos is not really about hate. It's about antagonizing liberals, which is not against our content policy. It's annoying, but we watch that community fairly closely because it's, I think, a very high-stakes decision. But the point of Reddit, as I was saying before, or the way we think about these decisions is trying to separate behaviors from beliefs. And as long as a community stays on the correct side of our content policy, so no spam, no harassing or bullying, no inciting or glorifying violence, no involuntary sexualization, we as a company will allow them to stay. And so we review these communities quite frequently. So changes we've made over the last couple of years are expanding these policies, getting better at enforcing these policies. We have had nasty communities on Reddit in the past, that are gone. We've banned a number of communities over the years, but banning a community is a very difficult decision because the slippery slope argument is very real, and we want to make sure we're doing so in ways that we can justify and behind policy that we can repeat. Because otherwise, we're just playing, picking winners and losers, and that kind of defeats the purpose of Reddit, and it defeats the idea of free speech and free expression. Now, as I said to the gentleman before, what we take very seriously is the sanctity and integrity of our systems, and making sure that no group of people, set of users, or community has a disproportionate influence on Reddit. And that's also an area where I think we've gotten a lot better over the years. So in this, I think, time of, intense political conflicts, I think we have to be even more careful and considered when we're talking about banning communities who are in support of the president. And I do think we should acknowledge that we live in an era where reasonable people can have a debate about whether or not the president of the United States should be allowed to tweet. But that is a legitimate debate that one could have. So I don't want to pretend that this is a simple issue or that it has simple solutions. But to represent us as profiting or promoting off of hate, I think is just a wildly inaccurate statement. I think Reddit does wonderful things for people and the world. What it does is it brings people together, I think, in a very positive and enriching way. So I don't think I can really accept that line of argument, although we do look at these things very closely.
Yeah. I didn't ask you that question for a reason. But that brings us to time. I would love to have this panel talk for hours and hours more, but unfortunately, both the Congresswoman and the Commissioner have to run to another event. So if I could have everyone here give a big round of applause for our